welcome everybody. So this is on behalf of the co-organizers, and also co-organizers Stefano, Vibha, Violina, and myself, and also on behalf of Gautam, who asked us to organize this event. So we are welcoming the keynote speakers, Linda, Henrik, Dan, Ari, Steve, Willie, and Zur, our wonderful presenters, Julien, Scott, Francisca, Shin, Evangelos, and Cindy, and of course, all of you. So really, thank you very much for being here. The plan for today is really to have a great time. So a little bit about the context, why we are here today. So the Org Science Winter Conference is a conference that has a very long history, has been done every year since 1995. It's the main conference on behavioral approaches to strategy and organizations. Labels for this today could be behavioral strategy and Carnegie tradition. Usually it was done at a ski resort, and it was a great place to learn about these traditions and to get to know the community. But then something happened. It was COVID in 2020, and we had to cancel it at the last minute. We really canceled it a week before. Was one of the first conferences that got canceled. Then the last 2 years has not been safe to meet in person. Hopefully this is the last year that we don't have a physical Org Science Winter Conference. So meanwhile, we thought that it would be very useful to meet online. There are many new ideas that are coming out, so we want to share new research. We also want to keep sharing the history and the prospects of these behavioral approaches to strategy and organizations, and we want to keep the momentum going. So many important reasons to do this today. So the structure of the event, first of all, we cannot replicate a real Org Science Winter Conference in the ski resort and all the conversations. So we set up a more modest goal, which is to share the kind of ideas that we could have shared in a real Org Science Winter Conference. We can think of this as to share some of the intellectual flavor of the conference. The format, we don't want to do something very long that can be difficult and tiring through Zoom. So we have a very efficient schedule. We will meet for 2 hours today and 2 hours tomorrow at the same time. And within those 2 hours, first, we will have a fireside chat. Today, that conversation will be about Jim March. And then in the second hour, we will talk about a new topic in the behavioral tradition, which is experiments. And then tomorrow, again, we will have a similar format. First, a fireside chat about the past and future of the Carnegie tradition. And in the second hour, paper presentations about multiple goals and aspiration levels. So the plan for today, here we are, the welcome and introduction. Then the rest of the hour will be the first fireside that Vibha will moderate. Then we will have 5 minutes of break, and the remainder of the last hour will be the paper presentations that Stefano will be moderating. So one last admin issue is about the questions and answers. So we want to do this an interactive session, but we are too many and the Zoom complicates things. So please don't use the chat to ask the questions. You can use the chat to post thoughts and links, but all of the questions, for the questions, we will use another platform, which is called Poll Everywhere. That the nice thing is that it allows you to post questions and vote on the questions of others. In that way, we will be able to focus the Q&A on the most popular questions. We plan to record everything and post it to YouTube in a few weeks from now, if technology works. And I think that that's all I have. Vibha, Stefano, do you have anything to add before we start?
So just to welcome to everybody, it's great to see such a great turnout. 4 of us have been talking about organizing this event in person since 2020. So it's been a very long conversation among the 4 of us. But we are very excited about this virtual event. It is something to keep us going till the time we see all of each other in person. So welcome everyone, and I look forward to interacting with all of you today and tomorrow.
And also from my side, thank you very much for being here, for making time. It's really a pleasure. Thank you.
Perfect. So let's get started with the first fireside, Vibha.
Thank you, Felipe. So, the first session is really about, Jim March, remembering him and his ideas. And we have a great panel for this particular session. So it is Dan, Steve Mezias and Zur. Very excited to have you here. Thank you for taking time to come and speak in the context of this session. The idea here is that you take a couple of minutes, just 5 to 7 minutes, talking about Jim as a person, but also some of his ideas and how he would like us to tackle some of the current research problems. All of you have known Jim for a long period of time as a teacher, as a friend, colleague, and intellectual. You've had rich interactions with him. So we'd love to have you share your experiences with him as an individual and also his work. So we're going to follow, let's follow the order that you asked you to prepare. So we'll have Dan go first, then Steve, and then Zur. And then, we'll open it up to Q&A. I'll moderate the questions. I'll monitor them on Poll Everywhere. So please, everyone, feel free to put any questions you'd like to bring on the table for our discussion for the rest of the session. So Dan, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks so much. And thank you, Felipe, all of you for the opportunity. And of course, I'm, occasioned to express my incredible, good fortune to have been a student of Jim. I suspect part of the sort of backstory impetus of the panel, this particular panel, is while Jim's ideas are alive and quite vibrant, he's a person who's not. And the ranks of people who had strong personal ties to Jim is presumably becomes more modest over time. So it's nice to have occasion to sort of this richer sense of him and not, what one just gets from the text. Talking about Jim is a challenge in lots of ways. One challenge I will note and a thread I will pull on a little bit is, he's a person of seemingly contradictory elements. And I would just, note maybe 3. So Jim is both a very private person at the same time. He's this big commanding personality and of course the ever-present extraordinary intellect, not just about the expected domains of social science, but humanity as well. But I think one of the more characteristic of, so Jim, we cite exploitation. He as a person was both playful and quite demanding. He loved playing with ideas, the on-the-fly verbal theorizing, the implicit modeling behind them. And if it was really going well, you might see that little glint of pleasure in his eye. At the same time, he had absolutely no tolerance for ill-conceived arguments or sort of academic pop and circumstance in the absence of real substance. Not bad, should be translated from his pretend Wisconsin farm boy, Scandinavian as high praise. So that's one sort of his kind of interesting tensions. Another one I would want to point to is Jim both had the aesthetics and skill of a poet and a modeler. And I would suggest actually are maybe not so unrelated. They both require a certain economy of language, both the poem and the formal model. And basically you end up with a sort of stylized, under-identified characterization of some more complex reality. But the hope is in that hall of mirrors of the poem or model, one can actually glean some powerful truths and insight about the broader world. You asked about channeling Jim in terms of our current context and challenges and so on. I wouldn't presume to speak to particular ideas or themes, and actually I don't think Jim would. But Jim had deep commitments to process and norms and values, and not to particular outcomes. So let me just channel that a little bit. I'm quite confident that Jim would be askance at our increasingly lazy and not terribly aspirational ways of scoring what constitutes academic accomplishment, whether that's the count of N articles in a prescribed set of X journals, a score generated by the Google indexing algorithm, or by Cleverett's 2-year look back, or on journals, or looking back farther on individuals. Many of you are familiar with his ideas about logical appropriateness, and Jim articulated about a basis of action. But it wasn't just Jim as a theorist. Okay? Jim internalized the logical appropriateness. That is how he thought about how he lived his life and his judgment of others. You do scholarship because you're a scholar. It's not more complicated than that. That scholarship might lead to some consequences associated with external reward, or maybe not. Jim was not oblivious to the need for junior scholars to eat and have a roof over their heads. But I think he also had the sense that you actually only needed one job offer to kind of solve that problem. And, being maybe a little biographical, let me add, but showing you the imprint of what it means to be the Jim student. So it's the proper Jim student. I'm foolishly in a PhD program in economics, spending my time with him. I double down and take a joint appointment in economics and behavior. And that act of perhaps foolishness, perhaps I might be the only person on this 100 plus person Zoom conference that actually has the honor of being turned down at their 3rd-year renewal, despite having a paper with Wes Cohen that ended up, getting some traction, a nice piece in ASQ with Mark Fitchman. I was oblivious to organizational politics as a good Jim student. You should be serious about your research, not transactional. And interesting articles, I think can be thought of as byproducts of serious research programs. So I think it's really quite lovely and wonderful that the organizers have thought, to sort of capture a bit of the spirit of James G. March, as well as the work that many of us are all so familiar with. So thank you. Let me turn it to my friends and colleagues.
Thank you, Dan. Right. Steve?
Right, so I've unmuted. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so can everybody see that? Great. So first I want to clarify in response to Dan that he's the only person who was fired his 3rd-year review. In my 2nd year of my 5-year contract, I was called in by the dean along with Marianne Glynn, who was in the 1st year of her 5-year contract, and told we wouldn't even be reviewed. We would just be terminated at the end of the contract. So I would agree. It's not being turned down in your 3rd year, but it may say something about the fate of the kind of people that Jim associated himself with. And I certainly endorse everything that Dan said about personally about interacting with Jim. I would add that any student in any of his classes ever, at Stanford at least, has spoken about the random number generator, which was his version of cold calling. It was a bingo-like device that he would spin and pull numbers out, and students had been assigned numbers, and you had to speak when you were called on. So again, I want to emphasize from that, Jim is provocateur, and Jim demonstrated his deepest understanding of human dynamics by his choice of words to deliberately provoke a way of thinking. So again, our first day of the winter seminar in organizational theory, he came in this most bizarrely colored Scandinavian sweater and described about how we could contact him by phone, but the woman who answered it at his house might not like that, which of course led to all kinds of speculations about, oh, he's living with some woman, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, let me now turn to what I actually want to talk about. And I'm going to run through these quickly. I'm going to basically only talk about the points in big print, and I have the ones in small font there for those who are interested. I'm sure you can read them while I'm talking. I'm going to follow here off from the lead of the very excellent recent volume edited by Christine Beckman, when Carnegie went to California. And I'm going to kind of take a theoretical journey using that. So when Carnegie went to California, I mean, by the time March left Pittsburgh in 1964 to be the inaugural dean of social sciences at University of California, Irvine, he had accomplished more in his career than any of us will accomplish probably in our entire career. So, I mean, just astounding. Then in California, he began to work with new co-authors to develop new alternatives to individual rationality. I think these have been understood in reaction to the provocation in a way that hides a fundamental truth that I'm again quoting from Christine's volume. These are neither a repudiation nor a repetition, but rather an evolution and a broadening. And I think these are really important ideas. The link to the earlier work has been severed in part by the choice of words like foolishness and garbage can. And I just want to pull us back to the line of logic, the flow that links all of them. And to do that, I'm going to focus on one of these, the organized anarchy model. And again, I don't use the term garbage can, first because I know for a fact that both March and Olson, I heard them say they didn't like it. More importantly, there's actually a theoretical point that I think is related to this that's important. So now I want to go from Southland to the Bay. In 1970, Jim March moved from Irvine. He'd had enough of being dean and went up to Stanford. Those of you who live in California know that Los Angeles is called the Southland, and obviously the Stanford is in the Bay Area. So what I want to focus on in terms of the organized anarchy model is models of public policy. And I want to start by stating clearly what the model is. It's a system level model, and it's done in reaction to the fact that individual level explanation is made difficult by problematic preferences, unclear technology, and fluid participation. And I've depicted the model here. This is adapted from Olson, 1972. 4 streams flow into the system: choice, situations, participants, problems, and solutions. And the innovation that Olson made that has been largely lost in the subsequent 50 years is that this model could produce outcomes along a continuum that had 2 ends. At one end is the more anarchic policy process. This is the garbage can. It's where the streams are independent, where there's more flight and there's more oversight. Johan pointed out that using feedback from experience and elaboration of organization and administrative practice, we could get to more structured policy processes where there would be more resolution and more interdependence. I want to now talk about the move from the Bay Area to Norwalk, Connecticut. This is kind of a personal move, but to set that up, there was a move into institutional politics. John Kingdon's work about policy windows and about how items get onto the policy agenda is one of the most important areas where the organized anarchy model has been applied. And a lot of it has been case studies, mostly based in Europe. This has resulted in some critiques of the model. The verbal and the computer theory didn't match. This again is an observation about Jim. Part of it is early Fortran programming and early on in the simulation tradition. But I would argue if you look at the 63 simulations, the verbal and computer theory match quite well. I know for a fact that in Dan and Jim's simulation, the verbal theory and the computer simulation match quite well because I replicated it. But I think John Bender, Terry Moe, and Schatz in their 2001 American Journal of Political Science argument got it right that this simulation was a bit of a mess. Now, subsequent work has fixed it. In the 40th anniversary, we got an application that addressed this. Henrik Grev recently is published with some co-authors using queuing theory to fix it. So I don't know necessarily that that's a big deal, but the case studies and the simulations do mean this lack of empirical work. I went to Norwalk, where the Emerging Issues Task Force was located, part of the Financial Accounting Standards Board, in 1994. And I did a kind of standard empirical verification. Showed there are measures of the 4 streams, showed that the process was somewhat anarchic, like a garbage can, and demonstrated that professional and institutional order structured the process. I want to finish by talking about Norwalk to Lisbon. Many years later, I often in part, it's my statistical background. I believe data sets ignore their degrees of, use up their degrees of freedom. And I'm kind of reluctant to reuse a data set, but I also get bored with ideas and I'm kind of never replicate my own work. But finally, I got around to replicating the 1994 study with the Parliament of Portugal, working with some colleagues in Lisbon. What we focused on there was the remarkable success of Portugal in creating a legal infrastructure for hybrid organizations. We sampled relevant laws from 1990 to 2019, and we've got findings that are somewhat different than the 1994 paper. It revealed a very structured, not an anarchic process. There's the main findings that support that. The streams were not independent, they were interdependent. And we found that resolution was the most likely form of outcome, and we linked this to some measures of mechanisms that would drive that. Going forward, I think the most important thing is to bring social movements and cartel politics, social movement sociology, cartel politics from political science, to understand how organized anarchies move from anarchy to structure, and also to kind of get a seat at the table on policy. I think the Carnegie tradition, behavioral theory, deserve a seat at the table, and I think this is a way to do it. And one of the key questions that I think comes out of the findings here are the task force, which was designed to protect the agenda of first the Financial Accounting Standards Board and second the Securities and Exchange Commission, was a relatively anarchic process. By contrast, when we looked at the Parliament of Portugal, which is the highest authority there, we found an incredibly structured process. So I think something is going on, and I think social movements and cartel politics might help us understand it, that's making sure that only issues with very high levels of agreement get to the top of the political system. And I'll end it there, and thanks.
Thank you, Steve. That was very interesting. Zur?
Sir, we cannot hear you.
You're on mute.
Okay, so welcome to everybody, and it's great to see you all here in the Organization Science Winter Conference. Seeing Dan reminds me that when he handed me the editorship of the journal, I asked him, well, who organizes the Organization Science Winter Conference? And he said, you. I said, me? I didn't know about that. So, congratulations to the organizers. I'd say that since this was done in Colorado, what I remember well that I learned sociology finally. I learned when I skied what is grounded theory. Anytime that I started to ski, I ended on the ground. And I'd add to Steve that right now we see another kind of scholar called Vladimir, who has very clear preferences, clear technology, very organized, not hierarchy for him, and he can destroy every structure that that stands in front of him. So I think most of you know all Jim's ideas. So I felt that basically the remarks should be backward and forward looking. One thing I thought about, I'm glad that, well, the last thing that I'm glad is about that Jim is not with us, but I'm glad that he didn't have to see the world that we live in right now. But let me remind you that Omar al-Sawi, one of Jim's students, basically did a study on Egyptian decision makers and basically said that those who go back into the past can have a better understanding of the future. And so let me say a few things about Jim, sort of going backwards. And I know I met him first, talked to him in 1975, and I'm going to concentrate on his qualities as an educator. So I wrote him a letter. He had no clue who I was and why I'm writing to him, but he responded. And he did that ever since, I think, to many, many students. When I visited Carnegie in Oregon many years ago, and then wrote to Jim, hey, I'm in Oregon, I'd like to come down and meet you. He said, sure, come Friday afternoon and we'll talk about cheese and wine. Wow, I was shocked, because I talked to another guy at Carnegie called Herbert Simon. He never talked about no wine and no cheese. but he had many ideas, okay? We wrote our first paper using IBM BitNet. So it came, you know, it was like not as instant as it is now. But I want to take you back to an AOM conference, either in the 90s or early 2000s. I don't remember. I think it was in Vancouver or else in Seattle. There was a panel there chaired by Nancy Adler, who brought in the first speaker, Michael Jensen, then Rosabeth Boss-Cantor, then Richard Heckman from Harvard, and then Jim March. And she introduced Jim as a person who has written more than 20 books, more than 200 articles, that he had 4 kids, about 10 grandchildren, and that has written at the time like 7 poetry books. The audience have never heard such a thing. They all got up and applauded. You know, but you hear about these scholars, they do regressions, you know, they have 2 AMJs and so on and so forth. Jim came in and said, I feel like I came to my own obituary. That tells you the guy had a very good sense of humor, an excellent sense of humor. That is very interesting. Let me just say that if you want to get his ideas, I think one of the things we tend to focus a lot on articles, but Jim has written 28 books. And that's the point, that were translated into Arabic, Chinese, Danish, Dutch, French, German, Greek, Italian, Japanese, Korean, Polish, Portuguese, and Spanish. If anybody ever tried, and he has another book that was published originally in Hungarian. Nobody can read Hungarian, you know, and then translated, it's like an impossible task. He also had 13 poetry books, 3 genealogy books about his family, directed 2 films, and so on and so forth. I say some of the things Jim started as his 3 degrees are political science. And when he came more to organizations and management, he talked a lot about power. I think we might have forgotten a little bit about that, talking more about expectations and stuff. Steve mentioned his deanship at Irvine, where he was the dean of the School of Social Sciences that had no departments. You know, it's one social sciences. So his integrative perspective, I think, is something that should be really remembered. And one couple of quick things about his legacy as an educator. I invited him once to talk to the PhD students and to the faculty at NYU. And what he did, he said, he wants to talk to these PhD students, and he closed the door to the faculty, wouldn't let anybody in. We then invited him to another conference we ran at NYU, and he sat all the time there. He didn't even move, like many people would go to the corridor, talk, and when anybody was talking, to give feedback. I think he was a model of an educator. And one of the things I remember that, he didn't, some of my colleagues have written on a paper that asked him to comment on with 5 pages of red ink, that basically was not that attractive. What he used to say is, yeah, just do it better, work on it a little bit more, improve what you did. And the thing is that unlike some others that I don't want to mention, he never closed his articles in a sense that, hey, I've done everything. I've done some things and you can develop it further. And I think the exploitation article is one of them. Jim has gone through a very long ideas career, starting from political science, running experiments, talking about power, moving more into organizations. And toward the end of his life, he basically, I think the last decade or so, talked about learning and experience. His last book that talks about ambiguity, I think, is really a must read, because but I think that's really the legacy of Jim. There is not one model like our friend economists do. Here's the optimal solution. Well, that can lead us nowhere, okay? You have to open up. You have to understand the limitations. And by that, expanding and building more knowledge that can be, continued by other people. I have never met a person like him. He was a model for me as an educator and as a writer, and his writing ability is amazing. As an educator, as building models and so on and so forth, and as a friend. And I wish there were more people like him. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dan, Steve, and Zur. That was lovely. Before I get to the questions, I actually also want to invite, we have Linda, Henrik, Willie, and Ari, who are going to be our panelists tomorrow. But just to get the conversation started, I'd like to invite them, and if they want to add something to what they've heard from our three speakers, or share some of their own ideas, that would be great. Anyone can get us started?
Mine was a question which didn't exactly get a lot of votes, but I will still say it because Dan called him a modeler, but I think that underscore that it's not exactly only a modeler, and I think it's important to realize that there's a lot of complexity and nuance, even in his so-called modeling papers, like exploration, exploitation. That's a very complex and nuanced paper that does have a model in it, but it's a lot more than the model. And of course, look, behavioral theory of the firm is a very complex theory, and the firm theory of political coalition is not a model, but actually a pretty complex theory of stakeholders and organizations. So this is perhaps more a question than a comment, although it's also a question to Dan, whether he would agree or disagree with me.
I totally agree with you, Willie. So I think I was trying to create the dichotomy between poetry and modeling, and then weave them a little bit. But you're absolutely correct. And you think about Zur, the lovely book on ambiguity of experience is all sort of, in some sense, anti-modeling. It's like things cannot be, we have to accept that ambiguity, and that's associated in some sense with understanding. So among his pluralistic approaches, and I think I also want to point to, I guess, and also why I was juxtaposing the poetry and the model, I think somewhat in the spirit of your comments, is understanding the model is a form of fiction, and a rather haiku form of fiction, and recognizing, fully aware of those, that's just not taking the model too seriously in some sense. And because, in fact, context is rich, context cannot be reduced to this way. And, Jim, I think actually your comments remind me of one of the many hidden gems of Jim. It ultimately did get published, but it was sort of just, this little essay had about Susan Sontag and heteroscedasticity. And it's this lovely kind of setup of, there are multiple ways of understanding. The econometrician can do their fancy tricks and understand. And Susan Sontag, as a critical theorist, also had a really important voice. And that was an equally valid way of understanding. So I think much in the spirit of what Willie is putting out. What Jim cannot be pigeonholed and categorized into these buckets. But at the end of the day, his heart is with Susan Sontag, and his heart is with ambiguity. And there may be some overarching ideas and logical appropriateness, and I'm not sure. Jim never modeled logical appropriateness in some sense because it was sort of perhaps such a it's a broad, rich construct that he didn't perhaps want to reduce down to the haiku form. So I think, Willie, your comments are really important and very well taken. And a nice, important supplement or corrective to sort of if I were suggesting otherwise.
And if I may add something to that, I get the impression almost he did the model to justify the theory, right? Particularly there wasn't a lot of empirical evidence, or in some cases, like in the behavioral theory of the firm, there was empirical evidence behind the model. But like in the garbage can model, there was a lot of discussion about the limitations of the Fortran model, et cetera. But that's a very nuanced, complex theory that's somewhat that's actually not that implicit behind the model. Anyway, I'll shut up. But I think that you're right about
the spirit. How many people have actually read the model of exploration and exploitation, but have been animated by section 1 and section 2, and ways that have been important and evocative, and that's fine. So I think there may be a little bit of loose coupling, and maybe I think there's some elements of insight of that, but there's certainly the contributing insight go beyond. So yeah.
Yeah, if I can just add, so this is the same man who, at a discussing session organized by a fresh doctoral student at the Academy of Management in New Orleans, where she brought in some of her colleagues doing positive organizational theory, who then presented this, offering an evocative, enthusiastic model. Jim, but they had sent the paper late. It was paper clipped and had come apart in the envelope, facts which Jim mentioned. And then he proceeded to basically summarize his whole reaction by saying, breathlessness is no substitute for rigor. At the same time, I would say in the exploitation and exploration paper and the garbage can, the verbal theory, as Dan has pointed out, is what's caught people's attention. But in both of those papers, it's very loosely coupled with the theoretical model, exactly to Willie's point. I'll just shut up by saying sometimes both the provocative and the rigor were linked very tightly. Again, I would say behavioral theory of the firm being an example of that.
Steve, how many people would have read the garbage can model if he would have called it a random model of something? Nobody would have read it. No. Everybody saw a garbage can. Yeah, what the hell is going on here? Let's see. Okay. So I thought it was strategic, the name, rather than the title, rather than, as you said, I didn't know about that they didn't like it, you say. Okay.
Linda?
To both make a personal observation and then I think a more academic question. Personally, I'm fortunate to have gotten to sit in on a course that Jim March taught. Steve Mezias was a student in the course. It was a great course on organizational learning. It was when I was a visiting assistant professor at Stanford's Management Science and Engineering department. And that year was really very important to my academic trajectory and putting it in a, let's say, shifting direction. But it was a wonderful experience. And I'm very grateful to Jim for letting me take that course and interacting with me. Willie and I had an interesting conversation about Jim just last week, where we were both saying that we felt that he had empowered us, or I think Willie used a phrase, gave us permission to do the work we wanted to do. So Jim was actually quite broad in terms of the work that he, supported, as long as it met certain standards. So he was not someone that would try to get you to immediately, work in some tradition he was working in. But he was really incredibly broad and incredibly open to a variety of approaches. As Dan was talking about the logic of appropriateness, I did have a question. I've never seen that idea really incorporated with the ideas of learning, but appropriateness seems like the ultimate thing to learn, a very subtle and a very nuanced. I'm curious whether Jim had linked those ideas. And I'll ask Dan, who's my expert.
That's a really interesting observation, Linda. I mean, and others, Steve, Henrik, others may have a sense, and maybe I'm primed by some other recent experience, but it is a kind of, one might, if one studied organizational culture, one could perhaps think about an interesting bridge between sort of how that, but I defer to my more Willie, Henrik, and others than Steve, but it strikes me as a really interesting observation on your part.
I'll give you my take on it. He linked appropriateness to Don Quixote in a sense, right? Which was not about learning, right? It was about this kind of romantic view of how the world should be, right? I think, though, that whatever Jim did, I think Linda's point about that could be and probably should be linked to learning and hasn't been, I think, is a very interesting point. At least that's my view.
And the empowerment was very important. And again, his choice of Susan Sontag to put in the title of a paper was not a coincidence. His choice of Don Quixote and the kind of Spanish fantasy tradition, which is a very long one, and which I think he probably felt was insufficiently appreciated in kind of the rationalist Anglo-Saxon American culture. And the fact that he donated a large portion of his estate to the United Negro College Fund, a year before the Black Lives Matters protests, tells you where the man was culturally.
let me move in with my little observation, and there might be a question at the end of it. So I think the interesting part, and we've alluded to this already when talking about him as a modeler and a poet, he's really the widest generalist that we've seen for the longest of time. I mean, the people who have spoken so far, maybe we're perceived as doing somewhat different research from each other, but actually we're kind of similar to each other, and we occupy a fairly small portion of the type of research that Jim was doing, because he's much, much broader. I mean, we happen to occupy the portion that has most to do with organizations and decision making, so we're very suitable for this conference, but he did a lot of other things. And even within the type of work that we've done, you can go back to the various things that he's written, and you can pick portions of it and say, well, this hasn't really been either modeled or studied empirically, and it might be a good idea to bring forward and pick again. In fact, this is something I want to just raise either for discussion or for consideration. I mean, what do we take next is really an interesting question. It's also, I also want to link it to one more, the previous discussion about was he more a modeler or empirical, or what kind of empirical? Because the papers, or I mean, different papers did different things. Often the same paper would do widely different things, and they wouldn't be 100% linked necessarily, right? if you know his writing. But in a sense, there is a particular type of modeler's thinking in that, because there is a reality, and portions of that reality are extracted into model. Other portions are ignored, and that's okay, because models need a certain kind of simplicity. And you can choose how much you simplify a model. You can even make models that are slightly contradictory because they capture different parts of that reality. And that's okay. And this is something that's hard for many people to understand. I mean, it's sort of, it shakes the foundations of the discipline of economics, among other things, because things are supposed to be the same all over the place. But that is, I believe, his form of thinking. And that's also the reason that, you know, being famous for modeling and also for wonderful qualitative studies, like in the behavioral theory firm, as an advisor of somebody doing just regular quantitative research, he was extremely rigorous. So all of those things came together.
Actually, building on Henrik's earlier point about what next, there is a very popular question on Poll Everywhere, which I just want to read out, and I want the panelists to react to it. And the question really is, if Jim came back as a 20-year-old, what would he write his dissertation on? So, and Ari, where are you? I can't see you on my little screen, but I know you're here, so please feel free to jump in. I see Ari logged in, but you know, while we wait for Ari to join, please, panelists, to Jim, a 20-year-old Jim, what do you think he would write his dissertation on?
Sorry, Ari is logged in, but he may be muted. Now he's unmuted.
Okay.
All I'm trying to say is that I cannot really participate because I'm sitting in a waiting room in an eye center where my wife is doing an examination, so I can drive her back. So I'm just listening, and I will participate more fully later today or tomorrow.
Okay.
Yeah, Ari, I hope she feels better. I would start by talking about what Jim did his dissertation on, which was in political science at Yale. And essentially, as I recall, it was about muddling through. So the dissertation essentially, the concept that came out of that was muddling through, which got him the interview at Carnegie, because Simon, of course, was interested in these ideas, and ultimately resulted in the 1958 book that they did together. So what contemporary intellectual challenge looks like muddling through? And I'm not really sure. I would guess it would have something to do with the transformation of economies under globalization and digitalization, and how some large entity, if it's a political science department, maybe a government, maybe the EU, is muddling through all of the problems that they have. So that would be my guess.
Maybe I can say something about this. First of all, he's the only guy I know who was hired based on an interview over the phone. He never came to Carnegie for a personal interview. Secondly, he already had a big chunk of the organization book, a draft of that book that he shared with Simon, which I think most of us don't know. So it's not that they wrote the book together once he got to Carnegie. He already had big chunks of the book, of the chapters written, actually.
Got him? Did you?
Sure. Yes, thank you. First of all, thanks to all the speakers. It was really a wonderful affirmation of what we are in organization science and what we are as scholars. And I think all of the speakers have brought up this theme in various ways. And I just wanted to emphasize how important at least I saw it and what I got from it, and as a reaffirmation for myself. And I think Dan's phrase kind of captured it beautifully. He said, in describing Jim March, he said, he was, in what what our life was about, he said, you were a scholar and you did scholarship. Right? And other stuff kind of just happened, right? And I think that's very, very important for all of us to especially the younger people amongst us, to embed in themselves that this is not your run-of-the-mill transactional sort of profession. It is really about a much deeper engagement with the world of knowledge and ignorance simultaneously. And in some senses, and this in part was sparked by the 20 years, as a dissertation topic. If he came back as a 20-year-old as a dissertation, what would he pick as a dissertation topic? And I think that's a wonderful question. But I'm pointing out the complement to that question here, which is that all of life is a balance between ideals and pragmatism, right? And pragmatism is saying, what is a great research idea that I can pursue? But I think part of what Jim March and what his contemporaries and students and colleagues describe is really emphasizing for us the ideals on this profession, in a sense. And I think that is a very, very important lesson to take away, because we can't all be Jim March. I mean, pretty much that's a given. But we can be bundles of what I call ideals and pragmatism put together. And while pragmatism, to go back to Jim March's exploration, this thing, very often pragmatism drives out ideals. And I think one lesson that I take away from Jim's life, and especially from all the people that spoke today, is about the affirmation of the process of being a scholar, not just the content of it. And I think that to me is a very big takeaway. And it sort of is a very, very important way in which our profession, I think, differs. I mean, all professions have this to some degree, but we are possibly at one extreme to it. So I'll stop there. It was just a comment, not really a question.
Just to say, Gautam, one of his poetry book is called The Pleasure of the Process.
Perfect.
Mark, you wanted to add something?
Yep. So I'm thrilled that Jim March is kind of the theme of the conference. I can't say I saw much of Jim in the past 20 years, but I still miss him from the time that I spent with him in grad school, as in his wine and cheese office hours and what have you. And my kids who are teenagers know about Jim March because every time I'm in a difficult intellectual or academic situation, I always tell them how I admire Jim March and wish I could be more like him. So it's kind of being passed down to a generation that literally isn't even old enough to read his work, right? But in any case, I was going to say though, on the topic of what he might advise, or what he might do if he were a 20-year-old grad student, and it's a really thought-provoking question. I suspect that Jim would be fascinated by algorithmic bias and by sort of the way algorithms get incorporated into organizational learning systems while having their own sort of internal learning processes themselves, the way organizations are themselves algorithmic in some sense. I think that the paradoxes and kind of the perversities of that process, I'm obviously very close to some of the modeling that he did in his, when he was in fact, a younger scholar. But I think that he would find that, a fascinating domain. The other thing I think that he would probably find fascinating is that, if he were writing a 20-year-old writing a dissertation, is, to the best of my knowledge, not a lot of Jim's work was very networky, right? I mean, that it could be converted into more networky arguments, but I think to some degree, just simply the computing power wasn't there to do the kind of modeling that he did in a more, in a sort of more network-oriented way. And network analysis has come a long way since since when Jim was a 20-year-old. And I suspect that if he were a 20-year-old now, he might be thinking about interesting, again, puzzles, problems, paradoxes in how networks evolve over time, and how networks get formed, how networks learn when they're more or less structured, and so on. And so I think those two areas, and of course, being Jim, probably the intersection of those two areas, are things that if you were a 20-year-old grad student, we might have a really fantastic dissertation, and then a whole nother fantastic Jim March career if he could start at 20 now and be as productive and as generative about it as he was in his lifetime.
Willie, I think you want to say something.
It's a fascinating question, but I don't think we have a clue about what he would write a dissertation on, because I think it seems to me that he was basically a contrarian that found things that were really important and nobody was thinking about then, and brought them to be the centerfold, right? If you look at his work with Simon was about there's a simple goal in organizations about following a simple goal, and here comes Jim March as a conflict theorist. And my understanding, he wasn't modeling through, but he was studying like what anthropological files of Yale that in small groups, right? And came up with some kind of data. So what I see at Jim March is more like, okay, you guys are all in this direction. I'm going to point out you guys have forgotten something really important, right? And I think that the grandness of it is that, wait a minute, we did forget about something potentially important, right? The firm is a political coalition, right? It's like everything is about, okay, a garbage can. Who would have ever thought of that, right? So this is my interpretation of Jim March, is like I have no idea what he would write a dissertation on, because it would be about something that I had never had thought about being important. And Jim March would tell us, wait a minute, how come everybody else is not looking in this particular direction? Because you should.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, go ahead, Steve. And then I think Zur wants to add.
Yeah, just to very quickly integrate across. I think. Oh, go ahead, Zur. Sorry, Zur.
I don't know the miss on what. So the issue about modeling, I think, in one way fits what people talked about in being generalist or integrated, because in modeling, what you can do, you can change the assumptions, and then you get into all kind of phenomena. I'd like to add also, Willie said that the behavioral theory of the firm didn't have empirical data. It does. Clarkson, the analyst, his decision is analyzed very nicely. And then Jim continued on that in a paper that he wrote with Tammuz and Sproul, learning from samples of one or fewer. Okay, so basically for him, data was not only like a million observations, but something that is meaningful that you can make inferences from. Thank you.
Yeah, and the form of logic, we may not know what problem he would have talked about, but the form of logic is clear. A formal model to capture what he believes we know. He'd look at what that model can't account for and criticize the model for not accounting for it. And he would do that with a verbal theory, and it would be very provocative and contrarian. So Mark's example, I think, is a great one. he would come up with a formal model of how organizations learn and then look at the bias and kind of take it from there.
So any other last comments? We have about 3 minutes left for the session. Any last comments? There is actually a question here. I'll state the question, but it's a food for thought. Given the current context, you know our world right now is quite complex, dynamic, changing. Can you think of specific ways to use Jim's ideas and wisdom to examine how decision makers make sense of and respond to faster and perhaps more discontinuous space of changes in their environment? Any quick thoughts, last thoughts?
I think, Jim, among other sort of sensibilities, would give some sense of modesty. I mean, he was, it was a complex world that he was looking at, and now we have even a more complex world. And so he also typically would offer a kind of more system sensibility. It's yes, there's focal actors are really important and serve as catalysts, but understanding them as catalysts and not kind of determinative. So I think, and Jim, was always a little bit uncomfortable with the idea about being practical and would want to offer these sort of some sense of wisdoms and perspective. But so I don't have a particularly crisp answers, but I think maybe these issues, and Will was alluding earlier, the issue of logics of appropriateness versus consequences perhaps are even more of important, compelling contrast in a world where consequential reasoning is so deeply problematic. And so we are not oblivious to consequences, but it perhaps is even a more, in certain ways, a challenging guard. But I'm babbling a little bit around a hard, interesting question.
Yeah, and to follow up on what Dan said, I would look back at this concept of integrative versus aggregative institutions from Jim and Johann's 1989 book. And I think we need to state the adaptive rationality and kind of benefit of democratic institutions despite their weaknesses. I think that's where Jim would want to be putting some attention at this moment in history.
Thank you. On that wonderful note, I think we have to close the session. So